He paid a dying man's debt in cold hard silver, and the girl he took home had no idea he'd been carrying her memory like a wound for 11 years. The autumn of 1883 arrived in the Powder River Basin with the kind of cold that had a personal grudge. It came down from the Wyoming high country in the first week of October, killing the last of the sage blossoms and driving the mule deer to the lower draws weeks ahead of schedule. For the Aldridge family, what remained of them? The early cold was simply one more thing that had gone wrong in a season that had been nothing but catastrophe. Rosalind Aldridge was 22 years old and had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 6 weeks. Her father, George, lay behind the curtain partition of their 2-room homestead. His breathing, a shallow, wet rattle that she had learned to count in the night the way other women counted prayers. The consumption had taken him slowly, the way the ranch itself had gone, gradually, then all at once. The cattle were gone, sold, one by one, through a brutal summer drought. The creek they'd farmed beside for 9 years had dropped to a brown trickle in August and never recovered. And Beaumont Hatch, the land speculator out of Casper who held their promissory note, had stopped sending polite letters 2 months ago. Now he sent men. The man sitting on their porch rail the morning everything changed was named Pollard. He had a face like weathered saddle leather and the flat, affectless eyes of someone accustomed to delivering bad news and feeling nothing about it. Rosalind stood in the doorway, her dark hair pinned back roughly, her hands still damp from the morning's washing, and listened as Pollard explained, with insulting calm, that Mr. Hatch required either $460 by the 1st of November or the deed to the property transferred in full. No extensions, no negotiations. "Your father can't work," Pollard said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "You can't work this land alone. Mr. Hatch is offering a clean resolution, Miss Aldridge." "The sensible thing." "Get off my porch," Rosalind said. Pollard shrugged, replaced his hat, and rode back down the rutted track toward the main road. She watched him go, her jaw set hard, her chest hollow. $460. She had 11. She was standing at the creek's edge an hour later, staring at the thin brown water and trying to think of any option she had not already exhausted, when she heard the sound of a horse on the ridge above her. A single horse, moving slowly. She turned. The man who rode out of the pine brake was not the sort of man you forgot. He sat a massive dark roan stallion, a horse built like a locomotive, and just as indifferent to terrain. The rider himself was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas duster, the color of slate, and a battered, wide-brimmed hat pushed back just enough to see his face, which was angular, deeply weathered, and framed by a jaw that hadn't met a razor in at least 2 weeks. A Remington rolling block rifle rested in the saddle scabbard. A long hunting knife hung at his hip. He had the deliberate stillness of a man who had spent years in country where unnecessary movement attracted the wrong kind of attention. Rosalind didn't know his name. She had seen him once before, 3 years ago, passing through Harlow's Crossing with a string of pack mules loaded heavy with pelts. Someone at the feed store had said his name in a low, careful voice, the way people mentioned weather that could turn. Tanner Croft. He trapped the Absaroka Range and the high wind rivers. Came down twice a year, spoke to almost nobody. He stopped the roan at the edge of the creek and looked at her. His eyes, she would think about later, were the precise gray-green of deep river water, unreadable but not empty. "I heard what Pollard said," Tanner said. His voice was low and unhurried, roughened by altitude and solitude. "460. Rosalind stiffened. "You were listening. Sound carries in the basin." He wasn't apologetic about it. He reached into the front of the duster and removed a canvas bank pouch, dark with handling, and held it out toward her. "There's 500 in there. Coinage, some placer dust converted last month in Lander, weighed and certified." Rosalind stared at the pouch like it might be a trap. Why? It wasn't a question, not entirely. It was more the sound of a mind trying to locate the catch. Tanner didn't answer immediately. He looked past her at the homestead, at the patched roof and the sagging fence line, at the smoke rising thin and gray from the chimney where her father was dying. "Pay Hatch off," he said. "Keep the land." He set the pouch on a flat rock at the creek's edge, like a man leaving an offering. "I need a wife. Someone to manage the winter cabin up on the Absaroka Fork, keep the stores, tend the traps when I'm running the far lines. It's hard country, but you'd be clothed and fed and no one would touch you." Rosalind's voice came out steadier than she felt. "You don't know me. I know enough," he said, and something in the way he said it, not boastful, just certain, like a man stating a known fact about geography, made her stomach turn over in a way she couldn't name. She thought about Hatch. She thought about Pollard's flat eyes. She thought about her father's breathing behind that curtain and the $11 in the tin box under the floorboard. She picked up the pouch. The road north into the Absaroka high country was 4 days of climbing and silence. Rosalind rode a stocky gray mare Tanner had brought for her, sure-footed on the loose shale and steady in the river crossings. He rode ahead of her most of the time, reading the country in a way she didn't yet have language for. A slight change in his posture when they crossed a draw where something had passed recently, a long pause on an open ridge while his eyes worked the tree line. He wasn't cruel. That was the first thing she catalogued, in the careful, watchful way of a woman who understood that behavior in the first days would tell her things that words never would. He made the fires. He handled the heavy camp work without comment or expectation. On the second night, when a late-season squall dropped the temperature to something punishing, he disappeared for 20 minutes into the tree line and came back with enough deadfall to build the fire twice as high. He said nothing. He simply did it. She lay in her bedroll that night, listening to the fire pop and the wind move through the high pines, and thought, "Who is this man?" On the third day she tried conversation, just to see. "How long have you been up here?" she asked, as they picked their way along a narrow elk trail. He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. 11 years in the high country. Came up from Kansas originally. "Kansas," she said. "Long way, needed to be." She didn't push. But the number stayed with her. 11 years. He would have been, she did rough arithmetic, perhaps 17 when he came north. Barely more than a boy, driving himself into the high wilderness like a man running from something that had teeth. The winter cabin revealed itself on the fourth afternoon as they crested a long timbered ridge, and Rosalind had to recalibrate every expectation she'd carried up the mountain. She had pictured something crude, a trapper's dugout maybe. Instead, the structure that sat nestled against the granite face below her was solid and deliberate. Squared log walls chinked tight against the wind, a stone chimney, a covered porch, a root cellar cut into the hillside, a small stable already stocked with winter hay. The surrounding timber had been cleared in a wide radius, not carelessly but thoughtfully, creating both firewood and sight lines. Tanner helped her down from the mare with a single firm grip and released her the instant she had her footing. He opened the cabin door and stood aside. Inside, clean, ordered. An iron stove, a work table, shelves of organized stores, bunks in one corner, a larger bedstead with a heavy wool blanket in another, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling joists, a rifle above the door, and on the mantel above the fireplace, among the stacked cartridge boxes and a folded survey map, a small object that stopped her where she stood. It was a button, a single stamped brass button with a raised pattern of a flying hawk, sitting in a small clay dish, as if it had been placed there deliberately and left precisely alone. Rosalind stared at it. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. She was 8 years old again. The summer creek outside Cheyenne, the one that flooded every spring, and that her mother had told her 100 times to stay away from. She had not stayed away. The bank had given way and she'd gone under in the cold brown water, disoriented and then panicking, and then a hand, a boy's hand, larger than she'd expected, had closed around her wrist and hauled her, sputtering and terrified, onto solid ground. He had been 16 or 17, lean and wind-burned, with serious gray-green eyes and a canvas jacket that was missing a button at the collar. She had only noticed the missing button, because, after she'd stopped crying, he had gently pried something from her clenched, freezing fingers, the button, which she'd apparently clutched off his jacket when he pulled her from the water. "Keep it," he'd said, and his voice even then had been low and deliberate. "So, you remember you got out." She had kept it for 2 years, lost it in the move west when her father relocated the family to the Powder River Basin. She had thought about that button occasionally over the years, not often, but in the particular way you think about things that were briefly, unexpectedly important. The button on the mantel had an identical hawk, identical patina, a small chip off the left wing that she remembered. Rosalind turned around slowly. Tanner was standing by the door, hanging his rifle on its pegs, his back to her. "The Cheyenne Creek," she said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Summer of 1872. The sound of movement behind her stopped. The cabin held still. After a long moment, Tanner turned around. He looked at her, just looked with that unhurried, serious attention, and something shifted in his expression that she had no word for yet. "You were 8, he said. "Blue dress. You were hanging onto a root and losing your grip." The floor felt like it had developed a slow, silent slope. "You disappeared," Rosalind said. "After. I went back to find you the next day. You were gone. My father was moving us north. We left that evening." He paused, looking at some point past her left shoulder. "He died before we got to Denver. I was on my own in Colorado by autumn." Another pause. "I came up to the high country. Stayed, but the button, I found it in the creek bed the next morning." He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything. "After you were gone." Rosalind sat down on the edge of the bedstead because her legs had quietly decided they were done for a moment. She looked at the button in the clay dish. 11 years. He had carried her out of that creek at 16, found her button, kept it for 11 years in a mountain cabin that no one visited, and then ridden down out of the high country and paid a dying man's debt to keep her from being swallowed by something worse. "You could have told me," she said, "before. Down at the creek this morning. You could have explained." "Would you have believed me?" he asked, genuinely. She thought about Pollard's eyes, about the weight of $460, about what the story would have sounded like from a strange man on a ridge. "No," she admitted. Something moved in his face that might, with more practice, become a smile. "No," he agreed. The first weeks in the cabin were a careful, mutual education. Rosalind had grown up working. The homestead had seen to that, but the high country had its own curriculum. Tanner was a patient teacher in the way of men who have learned everything they know through costly mistakes, and would prefer not to watch those mistakes repeated. He showed her how to properly seal the root cellar against the freeze, how to read the sky for the kind of pressure drop that preceded a serious storm, how to use the crossbow for close work when a gunshot would scatter the game in an area he needed to trap. She was not a slow student. In return, she did things he hadn't asked for and wouldn't have thought to. She reorganized the store shelves so the winter provisions could be inventoried by sight. She mended the 3 places in his bedroll where the stitching had failed, using the particular tight cross-stitch her mother had taught her that didn't loosen with heavy use. She learned that he ate mechanically when he was thinking through a problem, and forgot entirely when he was focused on something else, and she began simply leaving food where he would encounter it, and this seemed to suit them both. She also began to see things about him that the mountain had made habit. He always checked the tree line before stepping into any clearing. He slept lightly and was awake and positioned before any sound in the night resolved itself into something identifiable. There was a precise, economical quality to all his movements, as if at some point in his life he had calculated exactly how much effort each thing required, and had been performing it at that exact level ever since. He was not a man without feeling. He was a man who had learned to keep feeling at a distance that felt safe. She was starting to understand why. On a gray morning in early December, When the snow outside had reached the bottom of the porch rails and the wind had sealed them in as effectively as any lock, she came back to the cabin from the woodpile to find Tanner very still at the work table, a letter open in front of him. She hadn't known there was a letter. She hadn't known anyone even knew where he was. "My brother," he said before she asked. "Half-brother. In Colorado." He didn't look up from the paper. "He's written to say our father's second wife has died. There's a property dispute. He thinks I should come down and sort it. Will you?" "No." He folded the letter with the same precise, methodical care he applied to everything. "There's nothing down there that needs sorting. Eldon can manage it. He always could." Rosalind set the wood down by the stove. "Is that the real reason? Or is it that going back down means going near places you left?" The silence that followed was long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then Tanner looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression that she recognized because she had felt it herself. The look of someone who has been accurately seen and isn't entirely sure whether to be grateful or alarmed. "Both," he said. She nodded and didn't push further, but she stored it the way she was learning to store things about him. Carefully, without conclusion, to be understood later. The trouble came in late February, which was when trouble always arrived in the high country. When the winter had worn men down to their most reckless, and the passes were just passable enough for someone determined and desperate. Rosalind saw them first. She was on the ridge above the cabin, checking the rabbit snares Tanner had taught her to set along the Graham Trail, when she caught movement through the timber below. 3 riders, picking their way up the south-facing switchback trail. They were moving slowly, deliberately, and they were not trappers. Trappers in this country moved on snowshoes in winter, not horseback, and trappers didn't ride in groups of 3, with rifles unslung and resting across their thighs. She came down off the ridge fast, using the timber for cover, and made it back to the cabin 10 minutes before the horses reached the bottom of the approach trail. Tanner was inside sharpening his Bowie knife. She told him what she'd seen. He set the knife down, looked at her once with an expression that conveyed something she would later identify as assessment, checking whether she was frightened past useful, and then moved to the rifle above the door. "Bar the shutters on the east window," he said. "Stack the spare blankets against the north wall." He glanced at her. "You remember the loading sequence for the Remington?" "Yes." He handed her the rifle. "Back corner, high angle, covering the door." He picked up the sharps from the table, the big gun, the one she'd never seen him use, heavy as a fence post. "I'll take the porch. There are 3 of them." "I know." He paused at the door. In the gray winter light, with the big rifle in his hands, and his expression set into that particular stone-faced stillness, he looked exactly like what the settlements whispered about. "Stay inside unless I call you. If I don't call you in 10 minutes, go out the back window and take the north trail to the Henderson relay station. You know the way, Tanner." He looked at her. It was a brief look, but it had weight to it. "You're not getting snowed in up here on your own," she said. "So don't get shot." Something shifted in his face. He stepped out. The riders came into the yard at a slow, arrogant walk. Rosalind had positioned herself at the east window with a clear line to the door in the yard beyond. She could see Tanner on the porch, the sharps resting in the crook of his arm. The man in front she didn't recognize. He had a territorial marshal's badge pinned to his coat, but the coat underneath was expensive and wrong for the country, and the 2 men behind him had the look of hired enforcement rather than civil service. The badge was recent. The hostility wasn't. "Croft," the man called. "I'm Aldous Brand. I represent Beaumont Hatch's business interests in this territory." Rosalind felt the cold settle into a different place in her chest. "Hatch, of course." He'd taken the 500 and waited out the winter. "Hatch accepted payment," Tanner said. His voice carried across the yard without effort. "Hatch accepted payment on the Aldridge land note," Brand said pleasantly. "He has other concerns. Miss Aldridge was named as a claimant in an estate case out of Cheyenne. Her father passed 6 weeks ago. Rosalind hadn't known. The air went out of her for a moment. Her maternal grandmother, Brand continued, with the practiced comfort of a man delivering news he had specifically arranged to be bad, left a land trust. 4 sections on the Laramie River. Miss Aldridge is the surviving heir. He paused. Mr. Hatch has a prior claim document signed over 2 years ago as security against the original note. He's prepared to honor it. That document was signed under duress, Tanner said. That's for a court to determine, Brand smiled. Meanwhile, Miss Aldridge needs to come down to Cheyenne and appear before the land commissioner, voluntarily, or we can discuss alternatives. It was not a question. The 2 men behind Brand had their rifles out now, not raised, just present. The message was clear. They had a badge, a fabricated document, a judge presumably already arranged, and enough men at the bottom of the switchback trail. She was willing to bet, to make the odds disagreeable. Rosalind moved. She came through the cabin door and stepped onto the porch beside Tanner before he could do anything about it. She felt him go still beside her with the particular stillness of someone restraining a very strong impulse. "I know about the document," she said, her voice carrying steady and clear across the snow-packed yard. "My father signed it in the summer of 1881 when he was already ill, and Hatch's man told him it was a routine extension on the note. It was witnessed by 2 of Hatch's own employees. She let a beat pass. I also know that my grandmother's estate had a separate attorney in Laramie named Seward Gill, who has the original trust papers, and that those papers were filed with the Territorial Land Office in April of 1882, 4 months before my father signed anything." Another beat. "Mr. Gill has been notified. He is expecting us." This was true. She had written to Seward Gill from the Harlow's Crossing post office on the way north, a letter she had not mentioned to Tanner because she had not yet known if it mattered. It had taken her 3 weeks to receive the reply, sent to the Henderson relay station, and she had read it by lamplight the previous week while Tanner slept. Brand's pleasant expression had developed a seam in it. "That's a fine speech," he said carefully. "It's not a speech," Rosalind said. "It's the situation. You can take it to Judge Hargrove, who I understand is in Mr. Hatch's pocket, and you'll get a ruling that an appeals court in Cheyenne will overturn in 6 months when Gill presents the original filing date. Or you can ride back down to Casper, tell Hatch the heir has independent legal representation and a documented prior claim, and save everyone the winter ride." She let a moment pass. "But the man next to me has a Sharps .50 caliber rifle and better than a mile's worth of patience, so I'd make the decision before anyone moves suddenly." The silence in the yard held for a long 10 seconds. Then Brand looked at Tanner, who had not moved or spoken, and whose expression communicated nothing except the calm arithmetic of a man who had decided what he would do if necessary. Brand touched the brim of his hat. "We'll be in touch, Miss Aldridge." He turned his horse. The 2 men behind him followed without a word. Rosalind and Tanner stood on the porch and watched until the 3 riders disappeared back into the timber on the south switchback. Then Tanner turned and looked at her. Really looked at her in the way he had of applying his full attention to something as if calibrating it for future reference. "The attorney," he said. "When did you write him?" "October," she said. "Before we came up. I wasn't sure it would matter. You didn't say anything." "I wasn't sure it would matter," she repeated, "and I didn't know you yet." He was quiet for a moment. "You know me now." "Somewhat," she said, which was as honest as she could be. Spring came late to the Absaroka Fork, but arrived eventually, as it always did, with a quality of almost aggressive generosity. The high meadows going green so fast you could nearly watch it happen, the elk coming up from the lower valleys, the creek running loud and cold over its clean granite bed. The matter of the land trust was settled, in March by letter, after Seward Gill filed the original trust documentation with the Territorial Commissioner, and Hatch's prior claim collapsed against the 1882 filing date like a shack in a windstorm. The Laramie River sections were Rosalind's. 4 clean sections of river bottom land with good water and winter grass. She could sell them, which would give her more money than her family had seen in a generation. She could deed them to a settlement operation and take a share of the profits. She could do any number of things. She told Tanner about the land on a clear morning in April, sitting on the cabin porch with coffee, watching the hawks work the updrafts off the ridge. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked when she'd finished. She had been thinking about this for weeks, since the letter from Gil arrived. She had thought about what the right answer was supposed to be, the practical answer, the sensible answer. She had thought about what the settlers and the lawyers and the land commissioners would say was the logical course for a young woman with a clear title and a clean inheritance. She looked out over the high meadow, at the dark pines on the ridgeline, at the narrow pale line of the creek threading through the valley floor below. She had been frightened of this country in October. She was not frightened of it now. "The bottom 2 sections," she said, "deed them to the Harlow's Crossing Community Land Association. There are 12 families up this drainage who can't get water rights in a dry year. The river frontage will help them." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "The north 2 sections I'll hold, not to sell, for the future." Tanner looked at her. "That's most of the value. I know what it's worth," she said. "I also know what 12 families without water rights are worth." She glanced at him sideways. "You think I'm being impractical." "No," he said, after a pause that meant he was being precise. "I think you've been up here long enough to understand that what you have is only worth something if the country around it is intact." She hadn't expected that. "Yes," she said, "that's it exactly." They sat in silence for a while after that, the comfortable kind that takes time to build and can't be manufactured. A hawk found a thermal off the south face and rode it up until it was a dark speck against the pale April sky. Rosalind reached into her coat pocket and set the brass button on the porch rail between them. It caught the morning light, the hawk in mid-flight, the small chip off the left wing. Tanner looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I thought about going back," he said, "after Cheyenne, to find you again." He said it the way he said everything difficult, flatly, without ornament, because decoration would have felt dishonest. "I didn't know how to explain what I was doing up here. I didn't know if I could make it make sense." "It makes sense now," Rosalind said. He picked up the button, turned it once in his big, calloused fingers. Then he set it down between them again, equidistant. "Yours," he said. She left it where it was. "Ours," she said. The mountain man and the woman he had pulled, from the current 14 years, before looked out over the high country together, as the April light stretched long and gold across the ridgeline, and neither of them reached for anything they didn't already have.